Communicating Data Show. I'm your host, Hannah. And today we have Sophie Sparkes joining us from all the way in the UK. I'm really excited to have her on here today. Sophie is a freelance information designer, and I've started to see some of her live drawings and her other works online, and they're just so wonderful. And I'm really excited to talk to her today about some of her work. I don't think I've ever met anyone who does live data drawing. So I'm sure there's other people who are also curious about this. So welcome, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's really lovely to be here. And I'm an avid podcast listener, including your podcast. So I will look out and be able to listen to myself later on, early on next year when this comes out. And really looking forward to talking to you.
Awesome. So are we. First, can you tell us a little bit about what live data drawings mean?
Yeah, it's a term I coined myself. Trying to explain one of the things I do. So I'm one of those people who doodles in front of the TV when they're watching. And so my hand and my mind connect and I start drawing. And this also happens when I'm doing something like watching a talk or listening to a podcast. And I was trying to describe what it is I do because a lot of the time, what I capture are data points around what I'm watching or listening to. So that might be. How many times for a very old example now, I loved watching the Great British Bake Off, which I think
Mhm.
is it called the Great British Bake Off in America? It's called something a little different. Anyway, it's that very pleasant, tea and cake show where you have the competitors who are extremely nice to each other, competing about who is the best baker each season. And in the early seasons, there were Mary Berry and Paul Hollywood were the hosts, and there was one thing you could get a Paul Hollywood handshake, and this was like a rare thing. And when he was very impressed with what somebody had baked, he would shake their hand. And one of the things I used to doodle was count how many times he would shake people's hands. One of those, wet, dreary British weekends, and there was nothing to do, and so you'd binge a whole lot of old episodes. And so that's a way to describe the metadata. It
Mm,
wasn't what they were baking, it wasn't what they were saying. I was capturing what these handshakes looked like and
mm,
when they happened. So that's what I do. I capture the metadata around an activity. So maybe how many times people clap or laugh, or how many comments people ask, or where and when they cheer, how many slides speakers may do, if it's a panel discussion, how long each person speaks for, and who talks after them and before them, and I do that live, but when as I am listening or watching an event. So that's the live part, and that's what the sort of the data part is.
mm.
It's I'm capturing this information that is around an event I am watching. I
I
hope that
find
makes sense.
Yeah, I've been to events where they have live, artists, like
Scribes,
live
yeah.
painters, yeah, so, and they're painting, like, just a moment or they obviously
Mm.
cannot capture everything, which makes sense, and it also makes sense with live data drawings that, you're focusing on this one part, and what I find interesting about, when you talked about visualizing the metadata around those activities is that these are things that maybe in the moment of other attendees and participants they're not so focused on the metadata. They're absorbing and integrating the content of what is happening around them, what's being delivered, and then you're focusing on this other part that they may have not paid attention to, and then they get to see that different perspective, kind of like a replay. Like, oh, that's how many times he shook hands with who, and is there a pattern? And like, oh, it's so like these interesting things come out through these metadata visualizations, I imagine.
They do, and I also find lots of these data points that I capture, you're right, they're not the things people are focusing on, but when you think about the experience of an event, it's always in two parts. There is, what the speaker was saying, or showing, and there's also what was happening around them. So that sort of atmosphere, were they talking very quickly and going through lots of slides, or was it a sort of a deep involved story, and they only maybe showed 4 or 5 slides, but everybody was clapping or asking a lot of questions. So it's the other half of an event that you register. think, because if you that's why people like going to live experience or listening to recordings of things that happen, opposed to listening to or going to something that has no, it's sort of in a void of anything else.
Yeah. This is really interesting. Do you have like a favorite live data drawing experience that's really stuck in your mind, and can you share the story behind that?
Yeah, I will show it on screen and also describe what it is. So this is one of quite a few. So one thing I love, so this image here is from the Storytelling with London Tableau user group from November last year. For people who what listening, it is a the graphic I did was it's like a square stacked charts, and I was the I illustrated who talked when, and I captured how long who was talking. That's the color, how long they were talking for, which is the length of these. Some people think they look a bit like cats. Originally, I was trying to draw them to look like
Speech
speech
bubble.
bubbles,
Yeah.
but um, and then I drew a face on them, and the face was what was happening was because this presentation had Q and A's, had interactive parts,
Mm.
it had a quiz, it had presentations, it had people just talking. So I also captured what was the main style that speaker was doing at that time. So why I really liked this talk in particular is because it shows a lot of the things that I think are really exciting about doing something live. And you mentioned before that you've been to events where they have graphic recorders, people who are recording things that people are saying live, or maybe you can go get a portrait drawn of you. Um, and what I do is really similar. You capture a moment live, and that means you never quite know what's going to happen.
Mm.
And this is a great example where I can do all the prep in the world, but when you're actually there live, things never, ever go according to plan or how you expected. And in this case, so actually, I'll explain a little bit about my process to explain why this one was so interesting. While I don't know what's going to happen, and what data I'm going to capture exactly before a talk or a presentation or an event starts, I have an idea. So I will do some research and see who the speakers are, how many speakers there
Mm.
are, what format is it going to be, like is it going to be a panel discussion? I also read the talk descriptions, so I have an idea if I'm going to be tracking a few keywords, what might
Mm.
they be? Is somebody talking about decolonialization, for instance? That might be a keyword in their talk description, and also something I could track that's quite unique for that talk. And for this talk, the Storytelling with Data London Tableau user group from 2023, the description said that there was going to be multiple speakers. So they'd brought all their team, or a good portion of their team over. And they also said that this was going to be an interactive talk. There were going to be quizzes and polls. So I knew something like that was going to happen. And I'm a terrible speller. And so one of the things I do before a talk is to grab the talk name, the speaker's name, make sure it's spelled correctly. Sometimes I get it wrong. And add things like, this is the, London Tableau user group, and the date and things like that, and get all those bits down on the page. I also get the timings down. So I make little labels to say, 0 minutes, 5, 10, however many minutes long. And I can move those around later,
Mm.
but I get them sort of all stacked down in a corner ready for me to grab. Um, and then I go live and I see what happens. And a lot of the time I have to think on the fly and change what I'm going to capture. For instance, maybe I was thinking about capturing audience engagement. And after the first 5 minutes, I realize nobody's going to clap. I've had talks like this before. Nobody's laughing, because that's the etiquette for this type of
Mm.
talk. Or maybe it's a virtual talk and they've accidentally turned commenting off. So
Mm.
my great idea of capturing comments isn't going to happen. But for this Storytelling with Data London Tableau user group, the first thing when I got there on stage, I counted and there was one extra person. I was like, whoa! And it turned out it was Cole's husband, Randy Knaflick, and he was the second speaker or third speaker. So not only was he on stage and I hadn't got his name down, I hadn't assigned him a color. So I was like, oh, I've got, originally I thought I had 5 speakers and 5 colors. And I was like, I could, if I'm doing speakers, and maybe I can assign them colors. but then I had to find another color that fit in the palette and worked with the storytelling with data branding. And then Randy talked a lot. It wasn't just like one little sliver. He talked a lot. Um, and then come to, I'll show this again. So this originally, you might see, it was meant to be three nice, neat columns.
Mm.
So it's a 60-minute talk, and I was going to have 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 minutes. And then they said there'll be an extra time for a few questions. So I was like, great, I'll add an extra 10 to 15. So I'll have 20, 20, 70, and I'll add a bit down the bottom. That'd be great. But come minute 50, I realized that this was going to go a lot longer than, than 60 minutes plus maybe a few questions. So I had to sort of live erase half my drawings, redraw them, and add this extra column and squish
Mm.
this extra 20 minutes. And then they even went over 20 minutes. So it's all stacked to the very top, which I think shows some of the what was so good about the talk. It was really engaging and people asked lots of questions, which was brilliant. But again, live, best planning in the world, I'd factored for an extra 10 minutes of time, not an extra 30 minutes of time. So that sort of, but I quite like it. That's what makes it fun and it's not boring. I don't know the outcome exactly when I'm going to start. I have some ideas, I have some guidance, but I don't know when I start what it's going to look like, and even halfway through what it's going to look like, because I might have to do something like that and rejig the whole thing to add extra time or to show something, a different data point I hadn't even thought of at the start
Mm.
because something amazing happened during, maybe they did a magic trick. I can imagine that would make a talk very exciting. It might want to add in a magic trick field to the visualization.
Oh, that's really interesting. I've seen that visualization before, and I thought as a someone who's also an organizer that this kind of data is really um, it's really helpful for the organizers as well because you kind of get to see like where were we on time, and then like towards the end we really had to squeeze in a lot and we went overtime, which in events like this sometimes is great, right? Like when we're going overtime, when people are excited, they want to continue talking, they want to continue asking and engaging in many ways. Like that's also really interesting information to have that documented up there, and then also like who talked way longer than they should have, but maybe people really enjoyed that, and that's really cool to see. You can really see right away like who talked the most, and then like where the time really like people had to crunch in a lot at the end.
No, exactly. So yeah, it's good. That's an interesting perspective from an organizer's point of view as well. To yeah, that this kind of information is also helpful as well as being fun and engaging to share with the speakers or with your audience while it's happening or afterwards, which is sort of where I sort of I fit in. But that's a good perspective for me to know.
Yeah. In this digital age, a lot of folks, when we do data visualizations, we're using these digital tools, and you're hand drawing, even though it's on an iPad, it's still like hand drawn, using this like modern technology. Why do you think combining these hand drawn techniques with data visualization can be so impactful?
Yes, I well, we've been talking about live drawings. I also do create more traditional data visualizations that are hand drawn, and I've have been using Tableau since 2013, and before that SQL. So I'm in more traditional visualization. Runs through my veins, and I still every time I get a data set, I will reach for something like Tableau or Python or a traditional data visualization tool or language to begin to explore that data, even though I may end up either illustrating it by hand or including hand-drawn elements on a virtual, like a digital visualization. So why do I think they are so impactful? I am drawn to them because they're imperfect. And very early on in my data career, I realized how imperfect data was, how messy it is. So
Mm.
for me, data is always messy. There are decisions people have made around what data to collect and how to classify it, and what do we do with special characters in people's names and all the bizarre formats that dates come in, and then people try and store them in different fields, and then you've got to try and tidy that all up if you need to combine the data together. Decisions around and that's before you even get to the analysis. That's all what data's been collected and when, and then some brilliant human errors that come in around data collection. And so data for me has always been messy, and I like the hand-drawn element because I think it inherently is a bit messy. It is imprecise and it is imperfect. I think it helps communicate that messiness really nicely. Um, Also, in with now, especially with AI, hand drawn is different. It stands out. People pay attention. People have an idea how much time it takes to do something by hand as well. So people do appreciate sort of the time and effort you because they can understand and quantify it. Well, if something looks really slick and perfect, it might have taken you forever to code it, but equally it may be a template and it was a really quick update. Um, so yeah, those are I think the two main reasons. Firstly, because it does communicate the imprecision, how imperfect and how messy data is without you explicitly having to say that. And secondly, because it is not digital, it stands out and people pay attention to that and they inherently understand how long things can take to do by hand because everyone is, at least way back when at school, had to write something by hand or had to draw a picture and the you have a sense of how the effort it can take, and so you sort of can relate to that more than maybe some beautifully coded visualization that you is amazing, and I love them, but you don't know how long it took the person, and usually takes them forever. And but it looks really quick and slick, and you can't get a good estimate of the time behind it.
Yeah, I like how I hadn't thought about how hand drawn visualizations can help remind people about how messy and um, yeah, messy data can be, and these you're so on point about these visualizations made on a really nice data viz tool or program where they look so nice and slick. They look like they were made very quickly, and maybe some of them were, but they do take some effort as well. They're not necessarily very fast. There's a lot of thought and deliberation done, and hopefully, in a lot of these visualizations, even if it's on a digital platform. This has been really interesting to hear about how you're still incorporating hand-drawn visualizations in your process, where the end result is still on a Tableau visualization or dashboard. What are some common misconceptions you've come across about these analog approaches in this field where a lot of people are using digital tools?
Yeah, that uh, some of the common sort of misconceptions I come across, and I've had in the past as well, is that it um, if you sort of if you put your Stephen Few Edward Tufte cap on, that this is a lot of chart junk. This is not the data ink ratio is not correct. This is there are a lot of superfluous parts to data visualization when it's done by hand. I mean, equally there are lots can be lots when it's done otherwise, but that this is a bad
Mm.
thing, and I don't often agree with that, depending on what the point of the visualization is. And a lot of the time, the point of the visualization is to communicate a high level message. Even if this is like in a standard dashboard that maybe people view once a quarter, you want to know what the key metrics are and that
Mhm.
key takeaway is very different from the visualization you might have. And I use on Tableau if I'm beginning to explore the data and I want to know precise, I want to know precision. So when you hand illustrate, people think that it must be somehow wrong. So instead of it being a really useful way to show you information, other common misconceptions is that why bother to sketch or do any of this by hand? We could just do it on a computer. And I find that when I am working with Tableau, for instance, it's really hard to graph. I like to build things that look like speech bubbles with faces on them.
Yeah.
Really tricky. I've always plotting for hard charts. Um, or even doing some things like a network diagram in
Mhm.
Tableau. While that is easier now, the structure of the data you'll have to the how much work you'll have to put into structure your data might be significant. A waffle chart, you might have to pad your data out a
Mhm.
lot. And when you're illustrating by hand, it's just as easy to do any of those chart types as another. Um, so your baseline amount of time to make a bar chart opposed to making a network diagram or something that looks like a jump plot or a waffle chart or you know uh, isotypes. That's
Right.
just takes just as much time. So it means you don't constrain yourself to what is the tool can do natively and easily.
Mhm.
You think about lots more ways to communicate that information. And again, depending on the point of the visualization, who the end audience is going to be, and what you want them to do with it, maybe the best way to visualize it is a waffle chart where each individual, instead of being a square, it's a little person, because you're trying to show, a percent. And that is might be a really good way to show that information. And that's not very easy to show if you are, some tools that might be much more difficult. Again, the trouble with this is if you have data that updates regularly, yeah, hand drawing is not going to be the way to go. But
Right.
maybe bring some hand drawn elements into a digital project would be. Um, so yeah, I guess that's a limitation, but yeah, two benefits: that it helps you think outside the default set of rules that a tool provides you with and guidelines that they give you. Your Tableau's like help me menu type thing, and it also um, I think it is much more evocative way to communicate. So depending on what information you're communicating and to what audience, it might be I might grab their attention and help them understand it
Mhm.
um, faster, or make it seem less intimidating than a dry bar chart might.
Yeah. As someone who spent countless hours trying to hack Tableau to make a waffle chart or Sankey diagram, it is very can be very frustrating. And it's like I have it hand drawn right here. It's a lot faster that way, so I can see the benefits of doing hand drawn visualizations. I still use it in my process. A lot of my work, my deliverables are on Tableau, but I always start my initial brainstorming and prototype. Hand drawn and I try to keep in mind the limitations of Tableau. Like I'm not going to promise a chart that I know is going to be very difficult to make in Tableau or impossible. But I found that that's really helpful because then you're not lost in the tools and the mechanics of the tools. At least that's how my brain works. Like if I have a program open, whether it's PowerPoint or Tableau, I'm thinking about like how the drag and drop and these different clicks and boxes, and then I don't have a vision that I'm working towards. Versus if I have something already hand drawn, I'm referencing that always, and then that way I know where I'm going and I'm not getting lost in the tool.
No, no, that's yeah, it's same, exactly the same. But you'd be surprised how I talk to people about hand drawing visualizations a lot, and about half the people I talk to would not think to pick up a pen and paper in any part of the process, or if they did, it would maybe be to write something down, which is not bad at all. Um, but it wouldn't be to sketch out an idea. People and like I'm not a particularly good drawer. I wouldn't say I can count and move my hand at the same time. That is possibly a skill, like rubbing your tummy and patting your head. Um, but you really in it can be really ingrained in people that they are bad drawers, and to draw you have to be able to draw and make your people's faces look like people's faces and their hands look like hands. um, well, that's not what a good drawing is at all. A good drawing is something that communicates exactly what you want it to communicate to somebody. So if you're doing a quick sketch to reference yourself or to show to a colleague and be like, or a client, like, does this look about right, are we on the right track here, then some boxes with like a loose bar and whatever, it's a brilliant drawing, because you're like, this is the layout I'm thinking about, does this work? But a lot of people, it's so ingrained in them that they they aren't a good drawer because they're not particularly good at doing ears or something like that, so they just won't pick up a pen or pencil at all as part of their process. And I think that can really limit your how you think through a problem.
What other advice do you have for people who are maybe now curious and exploring or combining their creative interest with, technical field like data?
I say go for it, especially in the future world of AI.
Mm.
Um, the If you are really interested in doing something like knitting, or I mean, there's some brilliant, data viz people who sew, and they sew charts. And this isn't something new. I saw an example of a chart from sort of 150 years ago where somebody was um, basically stitched out a table of data showing like what was going on as part of their sampler, like one of those things you'd have framed or hung on your wall. Um, I'd say just go for it. Combine data is a brilliant medium. I listened. I was lucky enough to be at a conference last week, C'est la Viz in the Netherlands, and one of the speakers, his name is Stig, he was saying that data is creative fuel. So if you like doing something else, be that knitting, drawing, taking photographs and seeing data in, people see faces in like soup, maybe you see data everywhere around you and like leaves that fall down. Just begin using data as your creative fuel, because firstly, it might be really good to share with other people, and that's great. But more importantly, it will make you feel more creative and help you explore things that interest you. And if you think data just belongs in a dashboard and on a computer, then you might be limiting your creative options. And even if nobody else wants to see them, if you get pleasure out of doing it, then that's brilliant. And who knows, maybe your really cool cyanotype technique will be incorporated one day into a visualization that will help explain whatever you're trying to explain to somebody in a much more impactful way. Yeah, just go for it. Let data be your fuel, as this talk said.
Yeah, and it's everywhere. There's so much personal data for, your own life that you think you could benefit visualizing for yourself, like how much water you drink in a day. Or I remember when I was in the newborn trenches, I was tracking how much sleep I was getting and how often the baby was waking and being fed.
And then you realize like you had no concept of what tired was, especially like come month like 4 and you hit that sleep regression and you're sort of like, oh, I used to think I was tired. I had no idea.
I know, right?
And you still
What
get through it all.
I know, it's amazing. Yeah, this is really fascinating, and I love the ideas that you've sparked. Hopefully, for people who are interested in exploring how they can creatively draw and visualize data around them, and for those who are interested in keeping up with the work you're doing, especially any live drawings that you're doing, where can people stay in touch with you?
Yeah, the best place at the moment for to stay in touch with me is on LinkedIn. I'm at Sophie Sparkes, like in slash Sophie Sparkes, one word. I also, yeah, please follow me, reach out to me, send me some DMs, whatever you'd like. I am on X as well at Sophie underscore Sparks, but I am like lots of people in the data viz world. I used to love it, and now I'm still there, but I don't really use it anymore. I also have a website which should be hopefully going live soon, which is sparkscreative.com. So Sparkes, like my last name, creative.com, or one word. So you could also have a look there. And I'm also on Substack. Again, as data drawing with Sophie Sparkes. So I'm pretty sure if you just search Sophie Sparkes on Substack, you can connect with me, and I share sort of notes about what I'm doing and write a few newsletters as well.
Oh, nice. So some more behind the scenes content.
Yeah,
Cool, and I love how your last name is, being used so creatively for for your
I can
webs
claim no.
yeah, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's one thing I can claim nothing for. It was given to me, and
Yeah.
just happens. It sort of works with what I do right now.
Oh, wonderful. For those who are listening to the podcast, I'll be sure to link her website, her LinkedIn, her X profile, and her Substack URLs in the show notes so that you can easily connect with her on those platforms. Thank you so much, Sophie, for joining us today. This has been a really wonderful chat, and I look forward to seeing the work that you create.
No, thank you so much for talking to me. It's lovely to connect with you and see you virtually in person, because normally I just hear you in my ears.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, thank you everyone for listening. For those who have any questions or follow up, be sure to reach out to Sophie directly on LinkedIn or X, and make sure you subscribe to her Substack. And we look forward to seeing your website go live. I appreciate the time, Sophie. I know it's evening time for you, taking that time out today to talk with us today. And I appreciate for folks who are listening in. Yeah, have a wonderful week ahead, everyone.